So if people went on to YouTube right now, they could see us sitting here staring blankly into our screens.
That's what I'm trying to work out. Yes, they can. It's just behind us. It's so that Darren was right. That's so strange to see us like here we are, and it's the right link, which is great. So this is all worked out, but there's this ghostly difference between.
I'm not going to look.
Yeah, don't look.
I was on some event where I would speak and I was seeing the live stream. I mean, everybody would speak and I would hear it at one time and then see it at another, which was really odd.
So you can hear me now through your headphones?
Yeah, and separately. So I hear you twice, slightly different times.
I think that's because of the stream. Oh, actually, no, it's because we're in the same room.
Yeah.
It's so weird, isn't it? Like,
I know.
We were talking, like, we had this conversation a few days ago, Molly and I, about like, oh, should we delete all our social media or not? Because it drives us both crazy. And then I was like, it's not even going to work because the machines have changed how we relate to one another anyway. So like getting rid of your social media won't make a difference. Oh God.
I am so glad I've never used social media except for email, which after all is social media.
Yeah.
Yeah. And texting.
Texting can be fun.
I don't type fast enough on a little thing to be able to be very fluent.
People can go really like furiously.
I know.
With the phones. Massive phones now as well. The phones have got really big. Don't even fit in your pocket. Oh. I could have a look at who's registered. That might be interesting. Got some people like who had clearly registered but tried to like join before the event.
Is that like Ray Armantrout?
Yeah, I think Ray Armantrout tried to attend the meeting like on Wednesday.
Yeah. Shall I respond to the questions? Like shall I call on people?
Yeah, I can also say when we start, I can say like, please use the raised hand tool.
Yeah.
If you have a question, rather than like jumping in after the lectures like ended. I'll make a note.
Yeah. Okay. So after it's over, I'll say thank you, and then you say thank you. Now there'll be a Q&A. You said, and then we'll call on you.
Yeah.
I guess I should have a question ready.
And all you do is click reaction. I'll just say like, click reactions and raise hand at the bottom of the page. So easy. And then I imagine what that would do is it will alert us like when someone raises their hand, so we can be like, oh, such and such, please join in and make a comment or
Yeah.
That's a good question.
I'm curious to see who's going to show up.
Me too.
Did any of the English department poet grad students sign up?
Quite a few.
Good.
There's a fair amount of English department people who signed up. Some professors too. Yeah.
Good.
I'll also tell everybody to remain muted for the duration of the lecture. I think that's important.
Really important.
Don't want background noise, whatever. What I could do is I could resend the confirmation email to everyone now.
Oh, cool.
So that no one's like, oh, what do I do? I'll just do that.
I'm admitting Eugene. You're muted. Unmute yourself.
Okay. All
Okay.
Right.
You're now loud. Hi.
Hi, it's nice to see you.
You're muted. You're muted. Unmute yourself. Unmute yourself.
No, I'm not muted. Okay.
Okay. Okay. So why are we hearing the background?
Hi, it's nice to see you.
You're muted. You're muted.
I think.
No, I'm not muted. I'm not muted. Hey, let me just check something.
I think it's because the live stream is on. So Elliot's trying to fix that. Now, this is Elliot, by the way.
Hi, but can you hear my voice or no?
Yeah.
Oh, you can. Okay.
Yes, we can.
How's that?
There, now we're.
No, wait, what? No, now I can't hear you.
Yeah, I'm just not saying anything.
Yeah. Now I can hear you.
Yeah. Okay.
Great. So what I did is I put the live stream on mute, which is only a temporary solution. Hi, by the way. Thinking.
Eugene, there's something like 178 people have signed up to come to this.
Nice.
Yeah.
Is my background okay?
Yeah, of course.
What?
We should be seeing bookshelves with many, many books in Russian space out so that people can be impressed?
Yeah,
I'm only joking. I'm only joking.
it's I'm at my mom's actually,
Oh,
but she has lots and lots of bookshelves in Russian, except I'm facing them.
well, that'll be nice for you.
Yeah. So I have this incredibly complicated talk. I hope it works. And I decided to do the complicated words on index cards, so that, and also the names of people that I refer to.
Excellent.
I hope it works. I don't know. I've been working on this for years, actually.
Well, then we're the beneficiaries of its premiere.
I hope. Okay.
So is there any, like, so I think the way it's going to work is Elliot will start admitting people when they start arriving. And I will chit chat as faces appear, and, not very much chit chat, just tell them that we're waiting for people to arrive and please be patient.
Okay.
And then Elliot will come in when he's got everybody, as far as he can tell, in, and just tell people to stay muted, like that kind of instructions to the crowd. Then I'll do the introduction, which is slightly long because the donor very, very, very much appreciates having some nice words about the late Leslie Scalapino.
Yeah.
And then I'll talk about you a bit, and then turn it over to you, and then it's all yours until it's over, and then we'll come back and have the Q&A. Pretty straightforward.
Okay.
Yeah, just one thing is, I think if we all were to mute the stream, I mean, Lynn, you can see the YouTube stream, right?
No, and
Okay, well, I muted the stream and it helped, right?
yeah.
Okay, I don't think that means the stream will be muted for the people who are watching it, so I'll just leave it on mute on my machine.
Okay.
And then hopefully it's all good and they can turn the sound up or whatever.
All right. And if it's not, then they can complain all they want to. I couldn't care less.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it may not be necessary, but we've got really high turnout, which is good. So hopefully people will use the stream.
Yeah. How are your classes going, Eugene?
They're okay. Do you want me to ask about the live stream? I mean, is it is it streaming now?
Yeah.
Okay, so one way we can actually check this is hang on. Let's check this.
Yeah, I could put the link in the chat if you want to look at it from a different device.
I think I have a link somewhere.
Yeah.
And on my phone, let's see if it works. Okay, hold on. Okay, well, you can. Yeah, it works. It's fine. Oh, what? There's a delay. One way we can actually check this is.
Yeah.
Easy. I didn't know there was a delay.
Yeah, there just will be that delay, which is freaky.
All right. No, it's like talking to the moon.
Yeah.
Okay, someone is in the waiting room, but I'm not going to admit them right now.
Okay. Alexander Semenov.
Yeah. Could send a message at least. No? Okay. Where'd that go?
Okay. I'm gonna go grab some water and stuff.
Okay.
I'll be back soon.
How many hours have you spent working on this? Whatever, I forget, they're live streaming. People could be watching now.
Okay, Ma.
Person has vanished from the waiting room.
What?
That person has vanished from the waiting room.
Oh.
All right, we have like 15 minutes.
Is Una watching?
What?
Is Una watching? Is your daughter watching?
No, I think they're asleep by now.
Yeah.
And I didn't even tell them to watch. Because they have to, school, they have to get up at like 6:30 in the morning, and it's
Yeah.
9 now.
How's it going? School for them?
I mean, it's not great. I don't know what to do. One is constantly complaining that it's boring.
Yeah.
I don't, and it's a famous high school. It's bilingual. I'm afraid to just take her out of there and put her into a normal German school, because maybe it's even more boring. It seems, and it's not just that. I mean, some of it is that she knows the stuff because they have, I mean, part of it is the bilingualism issue. The bilingualism issue is like this: when you have a kid who's really bilingual and you start bilingual education, generally bilingual education is done not bilingually. It's done by like thinking that you have one language that's really a leading language and another language which is really lagging behind. And lots of people are bilingual in this way, like adults are bilingual in this way, but kids tend not to be. Kids tend, especially when one parent speaks one language, the other parent speaks the other with them, they tend to be basically native speakers in two languages, or almost native speakers in two languages. So you certainly need to teach them as if they were native speakers. But that's not really what's happening. And she is in she's registered as an English speaker who's, also speaks German, but she basically gets remedial German, and her German is
German.
past her age group. So it's a funny and stupid political thing. But it's okay. Are you teaching?
No,
No. Good.
Elliot is, but I'm not.
What are you teaching?
Teaching a composition course. So teaching freshmen how to write and research skills, and using 20th and 21st century poetry as the like entry point for that.
Oh, that's cool. That's interesting. How is that working?
You mean like COVID wise, or?
No, I mean, like, do they look at a poem and become terrified, or
Yeah, they do. I mean, it's funny because I gave them some material in the first week. I actually gave them some of My Life, Lynn's book, and some other stuff. And they were like, we don't understand it. And I said, I don't understand it either. They're like, but we use not understanding it as like a way to make an argument about what the book is doing. We don't just like say we don't understand it. So you could write like I said, you could write like a paper that's 5 pages about what you don't understand, and that could be a really good paper. And I think that helped.
That's cool.
Because they worry that they need to like extract meaning from it.
Yeah.
Rather than just describe their response to it.
Yeah, that's great. I think that's a fabulous way of doing it. And yeah, you're right. I mean, they come out of school thinking that like there's a kind of pellet of meaning, and that you take it out and you show it, and that's what reading is. But a bit like ads. Like their production is just very effective. And stuff like that.
Can you guys hear that noise?
Sorry?
Can you guys hear that noise? That little sort of pinging sound?
No.
Good. That's when someone's in the waiting room. So if only I can hear that, that's good.
Elliot, do you need to make Eugene a co-host?
I'm going to, anyway.
Yeah, but if you make me a co-host, I am going to hear the pinging sound.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you want to just not be co-host?
Can you share screen without?
You know what? I don't need to share the screen. I printed out the text. So I'm going to kind of semi-read it, semi-talk it. And then I just thought instead of sharing screen, it would just be nicer to do this.
That's great.
Agreed.
Because I'm tired. I mean, I'm a little tired of shared screen talks when you're looking at somebody's PDF forever.
Yeah.
So, is this okay, by the way? Should I put like a normal shirt on?
You look great.
That's great.
Okay.
I've been wearing black jeans for the last 2 years. And this morning I put on a skirt in honor of the event that no one will see. Except Elliot, who's in the same room as me.
Yeah. I'm looking outside my mom's window. She's right by the Brooklyn Bridge.
Oh, wow.
I see like the very tip of Manhattan Bridge and a whole bunch of, I think there used to be, one used to be able to see more from here. Now like buildings have been built that are blocking them.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a nice view.
Apparently there was much thought that after 9/11 that cities would no longer build towers because they
I
were.
remember that. Yeah.
And now they're going up everywhere, like higher and higher and higher. The San Francisco, which used to have like a lovely low skyline, except for Coit Tower, which is hardly a tower anymore by today's standards. And now it's just filled with these phallic monsters.
Yeah, in New York, by the edge of Central Park, on the south of Central Park, they built these super thin skyscrapers as apartment buildings. And the problem with them is that they're really high. They're super high. These are not like 40 stories. These are 100-story apartment buildings. And it's just too high. It's too high in the sense that the wind howls like crazy all the time, and the building is going like this. And it's steel. I mean, it's safe. It's just really, really uncomfortable for extremely rich people who live up there.
There's a tower in San Francisco called Millennium Tower that is slowly leaning and sinking. And they tried to bolster it up, and it's for very, very, very wealthy people. And the city or the construction tried to bolster it up and made it sink more. So now they're telling everyone, like, don't touch the building, don't mess with it. We're going to go back to the drawing board and figure out what to do.
But people are still living in it.
Yeah, they've been told it's perfectly safe.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
My text, I don't know, I thought of doing a lot of examples, but the basic thing is it was either that or trying to develop the ideas that I've been working on forever. And I opted to develop the ideas. So there's not a lot of examples. We'll see how it works. I hope it works.
Yeah. I particularly love ideas, so that sounds good to me. And I think examples can be hard to hear.
Yeah, well, for examples, especially with translingual things where you really need to look at a text.
Yeah.
So it has to be PowerPoint. So it's really labor intensive. It's either one or the other. I hope it works. I think it'll work.
I'm confident.
Same. I think it'd be great.
Good. 2 out of 3 is pretty good.
It's a 66.66% success before it even begins.
Yeah. I took part in a conference, also Zoom conference in France, where it was a conference on connections between Russian and American poetry. And it kept coming back to you, to Arkady. There were a good few people from Russia, from somebody from France, from Strasbourg, who gave a talk on doing. There was a lot of really interesting stuff there. It was a 3-day conference, which is long.
Yeah.
There was a lot of stuff in the beginning, especially about Whitman, about really the complete like Whitman as like the global poet.
Huh.
And which, it was mostly about Whitman's reception in Russia. And then there was Whitman's reception among Yiddish language poets here and elsewhere. But these are things you can completely project onto, I imagine also even India, maybe even, I don't know, maybe not China, but really all over the world. But that was very interesting. It gave me a lot to think about. And then there were papers on there's a really interesting talk on Allen Ginsberg, maintaining that he was a Russian poet in American dress, which is just entirely not true.
I agree.
But it's very interesting. The argument is very interesting, and it tells you a lot about the culture of the period, but also about, I don't know, growing up Jewish in Brooklyn, also kind of grasping at straws.
Mm-hmm.
There was a lot. It was the people talking from grad students to professors, and it was France, England, the US, Russia. It was a lot of places in Europe. It's a really interesting conference.
Who convened it?
It was two young women in Toulouse.
Was one Abigail Long?
No. It's not the usual suspects. No, it's not Paris.
Right.
It's not Abigail. It's not Vincent. It's not Olivier. No, and they didn't even participate, which is, I don't know why.
Yeah.
No. It was. It was the name of one was Delphine Rameau, and the name of another one was it was not Claire Kavanagh. It was Claire C something. It's escaping me at the moment.
Right.
But they're both very good. The presentations they were interesting.
Yeah, I guess that's one of the things that Zoom has facilitated.
Yeah, completely.
Like you couldn't go to that kind of event in person because you couldn't get all of those people together.
Right.
Yeah.
It made things a lot easier in that sense. But it means you can't gossip between the papers, or
yes. Or go drinking with everybody.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, but we're also doing a conference in Berlin on basically Soviet ideas of world literature, which are really, really different from the stuff that was going on in the US. This is like the 1920s, basically 1920s, although going into 1930s and then the 60s again. And it's going to be a huge, huge conference, but also because of COVID, it's completely hybrid. There'll be a handful of people in Berlin.
Right.
There already, and then I think everybody else is going to be electronic. So, Elliot, is your class electronic? Is your class by Zoom or in person?
It's been a mix so far. So I've done some in-person stuff and some virtual stuff. Should I start to admit people in 2 minutes time?
Yeah, that's good. I'll be back in a second. You can start to admit. Let's see what I can.
All right, we'll go professional now.
Okay, I'm gonna put them in.
Andy first.
I'm wondering what would happen if I open the window. Is this too loud?
Sounds good to me.
Hi.
Hi.
Okay, if this gets loud, I'll close it.
Yeah, I close the windows here because we have neighbors that invite their grandchildren over to play in the backyard on Sunday. So they aren't there now. So hopefully they will go to a park instead.
My windows are closed, but it's possible that my husband will come in plunking and, stomping.
Well, once we start, we're going to ask everyone to mute themselves so that we don't, that doesn't matter.
Hi, Lynn.
Hi, Ray. Hi, everybody. It's nice to see so many people here, including a lot of people I haven't seen in a long time, even on Zoom.
Yeah, I think people were getting tired of Zoom, kind of. I mean, it was such a big thing at first. Now we just want it to be over.
Hi, Eugene.
Oh, hi, Marjorie.
Hi, Ellen. Great to see you.
Marjorie, hi, it's Ray. Hi.
Hi, Ray.
Hi.
Hi. Are you in Seattle?
Well, I'm outside, a little bit outside of Seattle, about 25 miles north of Seattle.
Okay. So many people. And Bob Perlman, there he is.
Oh, I don't see him
Yeah.
yet. Hi, Bob. This is our time to say hi before it starts.
Yeah. I wish we could all be there and party.
Yeah.
The Mod 5 room would be honored.
But that's the good thing about Zoom, though, that we will miss is that people who live in really different cities or even
That's true.
together.
Yeah.
In
great.
different countries.
Yeah.
Yeah. And Eugene, you're still living in Berlin, right?
Well, I'm in Berlin, but I'm working at NYU at the moment. I mean, I'm working at NYU, and unfortunately, I had to go back this semester. Probably will have to go back next semester. So right now, I'm in New York.
Ah,
Nice.
Yeah, but the kids are still in Berlin, so it's not an optimal scenario,
Mm.
especially because now it's hard to fly back and forth.
I know. So
Um,
ridiculous. I know.
Yeah.
And nobody can come here. I mean, from Europe at all. That, is reading the Times this morning with all the sections on the arts and so forth. And it's like, the United States is completely isolated. It's really strange
Right.
when you see that.
It makes no sense now because I think we have more COVID here than most countries in Europe. I could be wrong, but I think
No,
so.
for
I don't
sure.
think it makes any sense anyway. If you're vaccinated, the hell with it. I'm in that group.
Yeah.
I hate masks and I refuse to spend my day thinking about COVID. I just can't.
Right.
There
Right.
are
But if you get on it,
There's so many people obsessed by it. Time to
If
stop.
you lived in Florida, you would be more obsessed.
Yeah, or Texas, right?
Yeah, but I think
Which
part of it
is-
is just reading about it every day, the latest and the boosters and all that. If we just sat back and relaxed a little bit, everybody would feel better, I think. I always think that there are more people killed in automobiles. I'm scared driving the car. First of all, I'm old. Driving is hard in a way, but every day I do drive. I think somebody could hit me very quickly in LA, the way they drive. And it's scarier in some ways than COVID.
It's scary because you can see
I'm
it
not
coming. It's
scared.
all around you, all that chaos. But in terms of how many people die, well, you could look that up, but my money's on COVID.
Yeah, true.
Well,
I don't
anyway,
know.
I think that it should be given how different countries are doing. I mean, I have relatives in Norway, and Norway has done very, very well
Yeah.
in the epidemic. And but I could understand why. I live in Florida. I have to, in full confession, I am interloper. My husband is actually the Berkeley guy, and he went to the pool, leaving me here because I'm the poet. So, but we live in Florida, and I certainly don't think my Norwegian relatives would want me coming over there right now.
Yeah, but it's that we could go there, but but they can't come here, which is insane.
I know, it is very foolish, given the
Why doesn't
statistics.
Biden change that? I mean, that was a rule that Trump put in, and it seems so Trump.
Right. And Biden should now get rid of that rule,
Yeah.
right? And if
Mhm.
people haven't seen their relatives from Australia, let's say, you know, if you have a
Well-
daughter in Australia, haven't seen them in 2 years, it's really pretty bad.
Yeah, Australia has some very quirky rules from what I understand.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's well, I hope a lot of people have talked about continuing some of the things with Zoom after we go back. And there's some very interesting, I took part in a really excellent hybrid meeting yesterday.
Mhm.
I bet there's going to be a lot of those in the future, hybrid meetings. You know,
Hybrid,
meetings
yeah.
with Zoom.
I hate to interrupt everyone,
should
but
start.
it's now 6 minutes after the hour, and I think most everyone that wanted to arrive has arrived. Please, everyone mute yourself and stay muted until the lecture is over. Yeah, okay. Do you want to?
Yeah. Well, hi everybody. Thanks for coming. It's really nice to see such a good turnout for this. I'm Elliot De Silva. I'm a graduate student in the Department of English at UC Berkeley. And the way this is going to work is, in a minute, I'm going to turn it over to Professor Hejinian, who will say a little bit about this lecture, the conditions of its genesis, and a bit about Eugene's talk, which is titled Translingualism. And yeah, afterwards we'll have a Q&A. And if you want to contribute to the Q&A, please click reactions at the bottom of the screen and raise your hand so we can know who wants to contribute, and we'll invite you to do so. Okay, Lynn, I'll pass on to you. And yeah, thank you very much, everyone, for coming.
Yes, I echo Elliot in saying thank you for coming. Welcome to this year's Leslie Scalapino Lecture in Innovative Poetics, which has been renamed the Scalapino-Hejinian Lecture in Innovative Poetics, somewhat to my embarrassment, given that I'm the Hejinian whose name has been added to that of Leslie Scalapino, while also being the person introducing today's lecture. It is, as Elliot said, on translingualism, a poetics of dislocation and language mixing, and will be given by the poet, scholar, translator, and my friend, Eugene Ostashevsky. Before we begin, I want to thank you, Elliot, for masterminding the tech and logistics for today's lecture, and for sitting a mere 15 feet away to give me moral support and help out in case of crisis. Thank you also to Una Ostashevsky, who provided the wonderful photograph of Eugene that graces the opening page of this lecture and appears on the UC Berkeley events website, and on the YouTube version of this, the live stream that's on at this very minute. The Scalapino Lecture each year brings to campus a major contributor to the innovative aesthetic theories and practices that have been foundational as well as intrinsic to the development of contemporary poetics. That this annual lecture series has a home in UC Berkeley's English department is thanks to Dr. Thomas J. White, Leslie Scalapino's husband, and literal as well as philosophical fellow traveler until her death in late May of 2010. It is he who requested that Hejinian be added to the title of the lecture series. I may be embarrassed, but also obviously I'm honored, and I most sincerely thank Tom for conferring that honor on me. The term innovative is prominent in the title of this lecture series and plays a key role in the way those of us involved in curating it imagine its situation in the culture of the English department. And of course, it is instrumental in guiding our selection of each year's Scalapino lecturer, or for this lecture and henceforth the Scalapino-Hejinian lecturer. Writing about her 1985 work that they were at the beach, Aliotropic series, Leslie Scalapino remarked, "I intended this work to be the repetition of historically real events, the writing of which punches a hole in reality. That hole is a portal to freedom, perceptual, experiential, cognitive, and the activity of punching it in reality is precisely what Scalapino would have regarded as innovation. She once said that her goal as a poet was to carry out, quote, continual conceptual rebellion, so as to outrun end quote, so as to outrun the deadening forces of habit, unexamined assumptions, cultural conventions, and societal expectations. Scalapino's multifaceted contributions to literary life in America were integrated into a single continuum. She was a fierce opponent of false dichotomies and reified aesthetics. She wrote plays, novels, poetry, memoirs, essays, reviews, sometimes all in the same volume. She wrote 2 detective novels, R. Hugh and Orchid Jetsam. She was the editor and publisher of the literary small press O Books for many years, and in that role oversaw the publication of innovative new writing by many writers of her generation, as well as many younger and emerging writers. And she was a teacher with a fervent commitment to the free life of the creative intellect. She hated stupidity, which is to say anything that impeded life, war, injustice, poverty, racism, cruelty, dishonesty, social disdain. She regarded such things as forces of destruction, body snatchers. To outrace these forces of destruction, to outrace conformism and stereotyped identity and self-perpetuated lies, one has to practice continual conceptual rebellion, rebelling even against one's own concepts. And one has to do it at high velocity and with ineluctable intelligence, indefatigable ferocity, and out of profound compassion and generosity. Such was and remains the spirit of Leslie Scalapino and the innovative something that informs her work. And though coming out of a very different context, Eugene Ostashevsky's work as a cultural historian and scholar, and as a poet and translator, is suffused with an innovative something that has deep affinities with Scalapino's. Where Scalapino's practice entailed the practice of continual conceptual rebellion, Ostashevsky's, I would suggest, inhabits a landscape of continual culture shock. Eugene was born in then Leningrad, USSR, in 1968. He immigrated to New York City with his family in 1979, and he grew up there in a rich cultural milieu that included other Soviet Jews who had immigrated to the US during the same period. In an interview with 3 AM magazine, Ostashevsky remarked, quote, "I grew up in a poetry culture that was all about classical prosody. I mean, I grew up on it in the States, on Joseph Brodsky Island. We had a Pushkin tree, a Mandelstam tree, and a Svetaeva bush. To jump from that into American poetry, no meter, no rhyme, just print, silence. That's the real culture shock," end quote. Eugene is currently, that is, at this month, based in New York City, where he is clinical professor in NYU's Liberal Studies program, but he spends much of his time in Berlin, where his wife and daughters live and where he periodically serves as a visiting professor and writer in residence at Humboldt University and the Free University. His current academic research is focused on translingual literature, which of course is the subject of his lecture today. In my own thinking about translingual language, I conceive of it as both an outcome of and a medium for travel. At first thought, we might imagine the translingual subject as someone who has stayed home and learned foreign languages by taking classes or hanging out with foreigners. But in the contemporary world, as also in the ancient world, translingualism might equally be the language of travelers, language without borders, language unbound. One might call it free verse, but that would be to forget that language never leaves us free. And of course, not all those who travel do so freely or voluntarily. Literature, Eugene Ostashevsky's first book-length publication, came out in 2005 from Ugly Duckling Press. UDP also published his next two poetry books, The Life and Opinions of D.J. Spinoza and Enter Morris in Pasternak, Pursued by Ironies. Both of those appeared in 2008. His most recent published book is The Pirate Who Does Not Know the Value of Pi, published by New York Review Books, which will also publish his next book, titled, I think, Feeling Sonnets, or perhaps Feeling Sonnets. One important background to Eugene's work as a poet and scholar is the avant-garde absurdist literature of the Soviet 1920s, composed by writers whom happenstance and history rendered out of place. One result of Eugene's work in this area is the publication by Northwestern University Press of Oberyu, an anthology of Russian absurdism, poetry, fiction, and drama, a major anthology of English translations of work by the central figures of the group that called itself Oberyu, or the Union of Real Art. I think it might also have called itself the Union of Real Meaning, since it is from the proliferation of meaning, from linguistic invention and play, that the absurdity, tragic as well as hilarious, erupts. And having erupted, meaning and its absurdities flow on, one word spilling out of another, which is to say one meaning tumbling after or over another, moving as they do so from one cultural or linguistic context to another, doubling and redoubling the potential for meaning and the potency of meaning's prolific, uncertain absurdity. Language can't outrun history, but it can raise doubts, raise havoc, and make fun. Here, for example, are the opening 8 lines of one of the Feeling Sonnets from Eugene's forthcoming New York Review Books volume. Berlin is green, it is made up of old growth and new growth. A fire took place here, a conflagration. It's called conflagration because it started with flags. A flag is a mark. If there's a mark, there's a market. I come from the market, make dinner, and engage in struggle. It is a struggle to get my daughters to sleep. They sleep in bunk beds. The bunk beds are contemporary. They come from IKEA. They were transported by trucks. My daughters are transported. Over the years, as Eugene and I have spent time together on email or in person as friends, and on a few occasions as co-translators, my admiration for him has intensified. I know no one whose erudition has a scope and thoroughness to rival his. He could be accurately described as a polymath, a person, in other words, a polymath, which as Webster's dictionary defines it, a person of great and diversified learning. He is also a creative thinker exercising an unabashed imagination with rigor and exuberance. And now please welcome Eugene Ostashevsky.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Lynn, for that wonderful introduction. And I also want to thank Tom White for inviting me to speak at this lecture in memory of Leslie Scalapino. And it's a huge, huge, huge honor for me. And I want to thank all of you for being here. And I have to warn you that I've been thinking about this topic for years, and I've spent months trying to squeeze everything into a talk. So I hope it's comprehensible. I'm going to try. I made these little index cards that will give you the big, difficult words. So I was supposed to give this talk about 18 months ago, March of 2020. The pandemic lockdowns began, as you know, universities closed. And had I given the talk then, I would have had lots more problems than it's going to have now, I think. I went through 5 full drafts of it. I couldn't get it right. And then I started thinking about why I couldn't get it right. And I think my main problem was that I was trying to justify my right to speak. And I was trying to present my poetry, not to you, to an imaginary audience, if that makes sense. And to an imaginary audience inside my head as a kind of legitimate and even respectable way of doing American poetry. And there's a lot of problems with that. And obviously one problem is justify. Because according to what criteria would I justify poetry or my poetry? Where does one get these criteria? The convention in the American poetry community, at least the recent convention, is to justify by ethical criteria. But I don't understand how that works. Like, am I supposed to present my poetry as a product that makes people better? Or am I supposed to present it, am I supposed to argue that like my product to make people better makes people better than other people's products to make people better? It's just, I don't understand it. And the other problem was the big word American. I mean, I'm American in some ways. When my poems get, I write in American English. I know this because when my poems get translated, like into French and German, it says from the American. But, you know, as you know, the differences between English-speaking poetries are less dialectal because it's the same language. They're more, so they must be more ideological. They must have more to do with the adherence to particular values, optics, concerns, practices, blah, 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 institutions, national poetic tradition. So you become an American poet just the same as you become a Canadian poet, an Australian poet, English poet, but by socialization. Socialization means that your values become so internalized that they become self-evident and unnoticeable for you. I could have been a better, I could have been a more credible maker of American poetry if I had an MFA, because creative writing programs now are where socialization into national poetry happens, not just in the States. But I don't have an MFA. And growing up, I read and I was socialized into two poetries simultaneously, into Russian poetry and American poetry. And I read Russian poetry more. I had contacts, friendships among Russian poets. And ironically, when I met American poet friends, I often met them through my Russian poet friends. Like, this is how I met Lynn, through Alexei Parshikov, and through Arkady, through Dragomoshenko. But ironically, I was writing poems in English, in American English, not in Russian. And as a young poet, I was a member of young American writer collectives. So now, having grown up between two poetries and inside neither, I write about, and in my writing, I perform over and over the collision between my two poetic worlds. And I write about my inability to make them come together or to match one another. They're untranslatable. They're mutually untranslatable, not just with respect to their language, but also because they display entirely different and constantly shifting assumptions about what poetry is and does, and how and to whom it speaks. So, for some years now, I've been one of the people reluctantly using the terms translingual and translingualism to describe my poetry, like when I have to do a talk, such as now. But the terms mean very different things to different people, and I want to start by talking about the different meanings of these terms. I've encountered the term translingual in non-specialist literature to mean something that's constant across languages. But that's, I think, the opposite of the way that I'm going to use the term. In literary studies, Stephen G. Kellman, for example, defines it as the phenomenon of writers who write in more than one language or in a language other than their primary. So this is already another meaning of translingual, having to do with second language writing, or having to do with somebody who, like Yoko Tawada, writes one book in one language, then another book in another language, then gets bored, then writes in the first language again, and doesn't see it necessary to translate between these languages. But as a poet talking about poetics, I need a different emphasis. I need a different approach. I need to talk about textual construction rather than translinguality as a biographical trait. Translingualism and translingual, I think, I'm not super sure, but I think come into poetics from applied linguistics. And there's also a related term, translanguaging, and they're sometimes used to describe real life interactions, which mix languages or monolingual interactions between people, among people for whom that's not a first language, the language of interaction. And studies of such interactions have actually produced a linguistic ideology that inverts the prescriptive norms of linguistic purity, of purifying the language of the tribe, to put it poetically, and correctness. And the linguist Kanagaraja, who is in Pennsylvania, calls the paradigm to which translingualism is opposed to, calls it the monolingual paradigm. For Kanagaraja, translingualism rejects the ideal of separate, self-sufficient languages. It rejects that the native speaker should be the absolute standard, the measure of proper usage. In general, it replaces the focus on correctness with a more nuanced focus on semantic efficacy in ad hoc settings. So it's about improvisation. And as a linguistic ideology, translingualism has entered the classroom, where it developed into a toolbox for educating students from diverse linguistic backgrounds, second language speakers of all sorts of different languages, who are now working in a language that's not native to them. Or else dialectal speakers, sociolectal speakers, and so on. But it's by no means obvious that the ideas that obtain that in the composition classroom or in applied linguistics should apply directly to literary texts. So I think I have to start from zero to talk about poetics. So to start from zero, we're going to assume that we have a situation where the terms translingual and translingualism refer to the instance when two or more languages appear in the same literary text. I'm going to make this more complicated later, but this is how it starts. Usually they won't appear in the text to the same extent. So let's call the language that most of the text is in the base language, and the text that the other language of the languages, sometimes languages, the inset language. So what can we say about the readers of such a text? Unlike the readers of monolingual texts, they divide into two very different groups. One is whose readers can read only the base language, and two is whose readers can read both the base and the insets, and the inset language. And two strategies for handling different reader capabilities arise. One is to translate or otherwise gloss in the base language everything that the inset languages say, making the text fully comprehensible to the functionally monolingual base language reader. And the other is to do the literary counterpart of code switching, which is, as you know, it's a conversation technique common in private contact among people who are actively monolingual in the same, multilingual in the same set of languages. So you have this opposition between glossing and code switching. So the result of literary code switching is that some information gets withheld from the functionally monolingual reader unless she consults dictionaries or the internet, a demand that many people feel impinges on their rights as readers. So at first glance, the glossing strategy appears more democratic and inclusive. It's also far more common. But I want to argue in favor of the second strategy, or at least explore the second strategy. So by virtue of being not normal, juxtaposition of languages in the literary milieu calls attention to itself. It's a high contrast move. When languages are so collided, the choice of one language always takes place at the expense of another. Like, why did you say this in French rather than English? The choice, therefore, cannot remain semantically neutral. What languages used to say what things and by whom and how becomes part of the meaning, even if not the denotation of what is being said. It becomes part of the meaning in two ways. Collision of languages, which is the term that I use more than juxtaposition, because I'm thinking of Eisensteinian montage as opposed to like Pudovkin montage. So collision of languages colors all the things said in each language with some of the associations that the language might bear for a given audience. An example of this that everybody knows is the cartoon skunk Pepe Le Pew, right? Who speaks with a French accent, but also puts in French words. And it has to do with the way that, American post-World War II audiences, the things that they associated, the sexual things that they associated with French, right? This is called indexing. A collision of languages also creates new ad hoc associations within the text. Things said in one language become related to one another as elements of one class, and things said in another language become related among themselves as elements of another class. Now, there's no linguistic equality inside a text. Languages jockey for power, producing tensions that one really ought to regard as political. In real life situation of code switching, when you code switch, it creates an illusion of intimacy between the code switchers because it keeps out the monolinguals, right? If you're doing this at a restaurant, people outside, you won't really be able to follow the conversation. Now, in literary code switching, you have the same social sorting, although you still have the options for people to go and look things up if they want to. Literary code switching also brings into play the social and hierarchical meanings that different languages bear in a given society by indexing the social standing or the history of the people who are likely to be using that language. So Sarah Dowling, in her translingual poetics, writing personhood under settler colonialism, which is a study of translingual currents in recent North American poetry, focuses on the political significance of individual cases of language mixing by exploiting this kind of indexicality, right? By exploiting that the associations and the history that different languages bear in a given society. Now, what's important for me is that collision of languages within a literary text is a Worfian, loosely speaking, linguistic ideology. It implies that some things cannot be said in this language, but must be said in that language, rendering individual languages semantically finite. By contrast, a monolingual text bears the unstated claim to linguistic competence. It implies that everything that can be said, everything that should be said, can be said in this language, right? That you really don't need multilingualism. When a text includes more than one language, but the terms in the insect language are glossed in the base language, remember I gave the two options, glossing versus code switching. The glossing implies the same kind of linguistic omnipotence for the base language as do purely monolingual texts. It places the functionally monolingual reader into what I call somewhat impolitely the missionary position, because it endows the reader with a kind of Pentecostal universalism, the illusion that the base language suffices to express all the meanings found in the tongues of other people and even of angels. I think the New Testament references are quite useful here. Since the glossing goes only one way, base language content does not get glossed into inset language content. The base language is positioned as a universal language, as the only language you need. And it subjugates the inset language, which become ornamental and semantically useless. If literary code switching may be described as a Whorfian practice, the Pentecostal, the glossing scenario is characterized, on the contrary, by the assumption of translation or translational equivalence, which is the belief that terms or a short piece of text in one language may be rendered by terms or a short piece of text in another language without significant semantic loss, or rather change, right? Just, it's exact, it's equivalent. Now, translation equivalence, once again, logically implies that other languages don't need to be learned, since everything that can be said in any, at least in the base language. My language gives me unrestricted access to all the truths that exist in the world. So Sarah Dowling and the German poet Uljana Wolf argue that the assumption of translation equivalence equips even texts that incorporate more than one language with a linguistic ideology that they, like Kanagaraja, describe as monolingualist. So now we've arrived at an even narrower, much more specific meaning that the terms translingual and translingualism may bear in poetics. It's a meaning that closely recalls the meanings of these words in applied linguistics and composition theory. So to start with Dowling's contrast between translingualism and multilingualism. Those of you that know Yasmin Yıldız's Beyond the Mother Tongue, the post-monolingual condition, it's basically a rephrasing of what Yıldız says. So Dowling reserves the term multilingual to refer to language mixing that assumes translation equivalence, glossing inset language terms for the benefit of the functionally monolingual reader. Multilingualism, in Dowling's sense, recreates real-life power imbalances on the stage of language, facilitating the dominance of one community of speakers over another community of speakers. By contrast, translingualism, which rejects translation equivalence, symbolically reverses or problematizes real-life linguistic power asymmetries. So this is why Dowling believes translingual poetry to be especially suited for political engagement. Uljana Wolf, the German poet and translator that I think many of you know, argues similarly that a multilingual poem is not necessarily a translingual poem, not if it's monolingual in its thinking. She associates monolingual thinking with a paradigm of internally complete, stable, clearly separated monolanguages. I'm quoting, transactions between which occur under the banner of translational equivalence. When we act as if translating would transfer meaning unchanged, the languages involved are little affected by their proximity, she argues. On the contrary, translation equivalence keeps languages separate and lets their borders remain stable, right? This argument against separation of languages, I think, has a slightly different social meaning in the EU than it does in the US. Marginal note. To go back to Uljana, so foregrounding linguistic ideology in this way weakens the requirement that I started off with that the text must physically incorporate more than one language on the surface. So, and Uliana argues that a poem written entirely in one language may actually also be translingual. And I call this invisible language mixing. And I'm quoting, poetic distortion of the mother tongue or monotongue can also be achieved by ostensibly monolingual authors. It's an aesthetic principle, not a biographical one, she insists. How can a poem avoid thinking monolingually if the text does not make another language physically present? The poem needs to abdicate, well, it needs to make another language metaphysically present. The poem needs to abdicate from positions of linguistic omnipotence and translational equivalence. It needs to come from a multilingual world. It needs to include other languages in the negative space. How would it do this? Uliana Voigt suggests that the poet may encode multilingual puns into keywords, thematize translation problems, impair the language by putting it under lexical or syntactical constraints. It may defamiliarize the language. Well, it must defamiliarize the language, the poem, imbue it with a feeling of the foreign, das Gefühl des Fremden, as the German Romantic philosopher Schleiermacher recommended for the language of translation. We'll get back to Schleiermacher. Translingual texts can be monolingual on the surface, but they have undergone a history of other tonguiness, of translational transpositions that make them translingual at heart, dislocated between languages. So now I want to talk about my own position. For me, my own position, which is tremendously influenced by Uliana, I have to say. For me, translingualism first and foremost involves a critical confrontation with language, with how we say things, and with what our saying them does. The product of this confrontation differs from the more linguistically transparent, elegant, and translatable language that contemporary poetry speaks in different countries and on different continents, right? The kind of language that one often finds in international poetry festivals. So in this present international style, which is not translingual in my sense, although it's certainly the main poetic product of globalization, the poetic lies in images, emotions, identities that the poem articulates, for which the language serves as a vehicle. But for me, translingual poetry finds the language itself, the phonetics, the lexicon, the syntax, the deixis, to be at once the source of the poetic and simultaneously the source of frustration, because when you meticulously attend to the language itself, its ability to convey clear and ready-made meanings is sabotaged. So from the beginning, I want to say that my idea of translingualism is indebted also to the avant-garde poetry and criticism of 100 years ago, which also declared itself to be about language and against using language as a vehicle. In fact, that's what my academic work is on. It's on the linguistic ideas and practices of mostly the Russian, but not only the Russian avant-garde of around 1913. And I'm not at all interested in resurrecting avant-garde poetics with its utopianism that I think has been discredited by history. But I'm interested in applying avant-garde insights and techniques to the modern experience of language, of linguistic in-betweenness and go-betweenness, of linguistic multiplicity, diversity, mendacity, untranslatability, and confusion. And here I want to say that, so Marjorie Perloff in The Futurist Moment actually points out that, if I'm interpreting her correctly, that actually the avant-garde experience of language came from just such experience of linguistic confusion, except they have theirs and we have ours. Or cultural confusion, because it involved all these people from different countries, a lot of whom were operating as second language teachers. Anyway, the modern experience of language is something that you feel really strongly as soon as you step outside the language of globalization, English, which functions as the universal language and does not do good things to linguistic diversity and things that it does in the name of accessibility kind of bulldoze linguistic diversity sometimes. The great book about this is Minai Muzumura's Fall of Language in the Age of English. So as you can probably hear from the way that I speak, I have a long personal history of linguistic confusion. I immigrated to the States with my parents. I could not stop. I kept immigrating over and over again, although in much cushier ways than first, mainly as an academic nomad. An early symptom of the inability to assimilate was the Russian reading that I did as a teenager in Brooklyn. It was a kind of rebellion against my junior high school and high school. Another system, one that persisted my whole life, was the difficulty of keeping languages separate and self-sufficient. Most of my informal talking involves code switching. When I can, I code switch. And I remember, I think when I was 12, so basically less than a year after I arrived to the States, I remember watching, and this must have made a tremendous aesthetic impression on me. I remember watching my friend Petya, or Peter, tell his grandmother that we're going to the lake. And he says, "Babushka, мы пойдем на lake." And I was like, wow, this is how I want to speak someday. And this is how I've been speaking since then. So as a result, my talking in any language is plagued by language transfer, which is the application of features of one language to another language, and language attrition, the loss of features of a language because you stop practicing them and you're practicing another language and you kind of need to clue back in after a while. My accent in English, I mean, you can hear my intonation in Russian is also weird, not native, or not native, but kind of not local. And in other languages that I partially learned later on, things are just infinitely worse. I make long pauses between words. I wave my hands, which I forgot to put this in the paper, but I'm looking at my own reflection in Zoom. And yes, I talk with my hands. I make huge pauses. I forget words, and I even hear badly. So I might be multilingual I might be multilingual on paper, but I'm also inarticulate and non-lingual, which makes my linguistic experience quite common. I often find myself in linguistic environments where I don't understand the language, where I don't understand the message, or where I understand it otherwise than it's meant. So maybe I'm telling you all this as like this American rhetorical move and authenticity play. But in fact, you don't need my linguistic problems to work translingually. We've all of us have experienced linguistic deprivation and isolation, even people who have never learned one language. Many men still use grunts to communicate with their loved ones, which elevates both them and their loved ones to the status of translingual subjects. I was trying to think of like monolingual example of translingualism. And I think men going, ugh, is, pretty good one. So Uliana argues that the heart of translingual writing lies in estranging language. I want to pause a bit on the term estrangement, on its predecessors and synonyms. So in English, its closest synonym is defamiliarization. And with respect to Russian, as most of you know, estrangement translates Shklovsky's signature term of ostranение, making strange. For Shklovsky, art encourages art estranges, not encourages, discourages our automatic habitual perception of things and lets us perceive them anew. But it's also possible for art to estrange not things in the world, but a particular kind of things in the world, which is the language of the art, right? So language estranging itself. The language of poetry does this. The point of language of poetry, for Shklovsky, is that it de-automatizes the language of everyday life. The early publications of the Russian formalists repeat the analogy between the language of poetry and foreign language speaking over and over and over and over, right? If you look at old issues of Poetica, it's in every article. Because both the language of poetry and foreign language speaking impede and de-automatize linguistic processing. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. In German, there's a great word for estrangement, and it's Verfremdung. And because literally it means foreignization, because Fremdsprache means foreign language. In translation theory, and now I'm quoting Schleiermacher, the difficult task of representing the foreign in one's own mother tongue by bending the latter to a foreign likeness was first advocated by Friedrich Schleiermacher. Yet the aesthetic and ideological effects of foreignization, as opposed to domestication, may prove desirable, despite Schleiermacher's ideas, not just in translations, but also in original poetic compositions. Brecht, I just had Brecht's name up also, his employment of Verfremdung in Verfremdungseffekt in theater is basically a way of taking Shklovsky's idea of estranenia and raising it to the metalinguistic level in order to replace mimesis in theater with theater that knows itself to be theater. So I call translingual the linguistic estrangement that arises when the poet acts like a language learner. So I agree with Uliana that a translingual poem need not bear more than a single language on its surface. The simplest kind of translingual estrangement asks the poet to surrender her certainty that she knows what words mean, what things are, and how words and things relate to each other. Everything has to be approached provisionally and made out anew, just like being immersed in a foreign environment. And this is why translingual poetry must articulate metalinguistic concerns, directly or indirectly. Because language learners, the metalinguistic behavior of language learners, in which they engage all the time, ranges from asking for the names of things to taking explicit notice of syntax, phraseology, even pragmatics, like when do you say this, to whom you say this, to whom you don't say this. So translingual poetry constantly asks for the meanings and doings of words or expressions or rules or speech acts, either explicitly or by staging them in a defamiliarizing manner. To talk about myself, I am incapable of discussing any subject independently of discussing ways of discussing it. And you've seen that already. I don't write about things, I write about the relations between words and things. When I read about feelings, my first and last question is how the words for feelings affect the feelings. And I'm not alone in this. For example, Murat, I think I saw Murat Nemetnejad, in the poem Ankara, My Kind-Hearted Stepmother, represents his childhood memories of Turkey, but he represents them translingually, not just like I remember going back to this, or I remember that, but by running the memories through all these planes of Turkish words. Which are glossed or which enter into these relations with one another. And this contemplation of verbal meanings and forms becomes the primary subject of the poem, of the translingual poem. which means that what you're trying to do is you're trying to observe words. And to observe words, you place obstacles in the way of their flow. Oh, sorry, I didn't put the Laurent's name up. This is how it's put. Obstacle techniques, consonant clusters causing phonetic dissonance, syntactic stops, rhythmic skips, which cause rhythmic dissonance, cuts on words, turns on phrases causing semantic double takes, and so on. The poem is slowed down to foreground the materiality and or the polysemic possibilities of the individual words or phrases. A parallel with language learning arises once again, and I tried to read a few kind of specialist texts on L2 on second language processing. I hope I understood them correctly. As far as I understood, foreign language processing is significantly slower than native processing, right? This is data that comes from computerized word recognition tests, association tests, also priming tests. In the beginning, when you're starting to learn the language and the automatization is lacking, the language learner hesitates in the intervals between words or phrases, searches for better ways of saying something, even engages in acts of translation at a crippling economic expense. But even with the automatization that comes with fluency, when doubt recedes and inner translation doesn't take place, and you kind of go out for a drink and you relax and talk in another language, the processing rate for a learned language still remains slower than for a language learned in early childhood and practiced thereafter. This has been demonstrated a number of times by a wide variety of scientists. Language learners display a heightened concern for the sounds and shapes of words. Many of you know Schwitters's What a Beauty, which is a poem that I think he learned when he started learning English after fleeing to UK in 1940. It has to do with the weirdness of the word beauty. What a beauty, right? As seen by the language learner. Twerk, a collection by Latasha Nevada Diggs, is able to insert into its varying Englishes an astounding array of fragments of wildly different languages, precisely because the poet is learning them, right? She uses so many languages that she can't, I mean, maybe she can, but she can't possibly, speak them like a native. So she doesn't claim mastery over them. The French language, the Romanian French poet Gerasim Luca fills his early poems with French words that sound the same, but they differ in meaning and spelling. If you look at his early poems, they seem super translingual in just this way. He repeats the same sounds and embeds it in different words. And so he builds a poem whose elements, lexical elements, look like they're etymologically related to one another, right? So it doesn't seem like just repetition of sound, but also repetition of meaning, which gets us to something super important. Etymology has a special salience for language learners. Encountering an unknown word, language learners examine not just the sentential context, but also the form of the word for clues about meaning. Comparison of the forms of unknown words to those of known words may yield information by means of morphological and etymological, it's more right to say pseudo-etymological analogies. In fact, Uljana's new book, Etymologische Gossip, you can see how difficult it is to switch from one language to another. Uses etymology in precisely this sense of the word. An unknown word that resembles a known word formally feels likely to relate to it semantically in some way. And in fact, this is another scientific fact that I may have misunderstood. The memories of language learners also seem to associate words by formal resemblance to a far greater extent than the memories of native speakers, who seem to associate and classify words more by semantic characteristics, right? And this is not just language learners, but people that have been speaking language for a very long time, right? It just wasn't there first, and they didn't learn it in childhood. So what does this mean? Pseudo-etymology. What does this mean? This means that when the language learners encounter an unknown word, their first instinct is basically to pun, because the poetic technique of punning may be defined as establishing semantic relations between words on the basis of formal resemblance. It's just like pseudo-etymology. So proclivity towards punning is one of the distinguishing marks of translingual poetry. This is an extremely self-interested argument if you've read my poems. Our general tendency to understand the familiar through the unfamiliar through the familiar results in language transfer, when the language we know well shapes our reception of a language we know less well. It's not the only kind of language transfer, but it's the main kind. We read the elements of a foreign language via formally similar elements in the language we know, whether syntactical, lexical, or morphological, or idiomatic. So when we start learning a language, in our earliest encounters with a language, with a new language, the puns we make are multilingual. They're external or multilingual pseudo-etymologies. I didn't think of making an index cards that said, "Help, I'm giving a talk." As English speakers, we might interpret the unfamiliar German word der Hummer as something having to do with humming, or as a thing that hums, especially because humming, hum, it's onomatopoeic. So we think that that's what der Hummer is. We will surely, even if we don't think that that's what it means, we will associate the two words, right? Der Hummer with humming. Hummer means lobster, right? There's no verb hummen in German meaning to hum. It doesn't exist. It's a false etymology. Russian speakers might know how they might know better, because Russian and Turkish are not as related as English and German. So when they see or hear the Turkish word yazık, which in Turkish means shame, they might know not to say, "Oh, okay, well, this is yazık" in Russian means language. So they might know to say, not to say that, okay, well, this must mean language. But it's very hard for them not to make that association, right? Does that make sense, this distinction that I'm making? The paths to language learning are strewn with false friends. These are words whose shared form means different things in different languages. I don't know, French librairie, bookstore, not library. French, this one always kills me. French passer un examen is not to pass an exam, but to take an exam, right? So if you fail an exam, you can still say passer. Uliana Wolf has invented a group of poetic techniques which are based on English-German false friends, where she sets false friends into German sentences, but bearing English meaning. So the words bear English meaning, but the sentence is in German. So it's really disorienting. It's not the only technique that she uses. This is a book from, if I remember correctly, 2008. It's called Falsche Freunde, False Friends. Most advanced language learners are more likely to decipher unknown words to words already known in the language being learned. So advanced language learners pun monolingually in the language that they're learning, which means that punning does not need to be multilingual to be translingual. In fact, the word pun now we get a little more difficult. Does not suffice to indicate the broad spectrum of opportunities presented for poetic play by word recognition strategies. A more general term for bringing together like-seeming words is paronomasia. Long term, doesn't fit on the index cards. Paronomasia is when a poem clusters or repeats formally similar features, especially, but by no means exclusively, those that are similar phonetically. The general rule is that the closer the words come to one another in the space of the text, the more striking their form of similarity, right? So it's like gravity. So to show the semantic consequences of paronomasia, I will cite a very simple example from Auden, from a poem that probably all of you know. "Oh, where are you going?" said reader to writer. "That valley is fatal where furnaces burn. Yonder's the midden whose odors will madden. That gap is the grave where the tall return." So the reader or the hearer immediately recognizes three very tight paronomastic pairs: reader and writer, midden and madden, and yonder and odor. Because the reader is primed, because the appearance of like these obvious pairs makes you say, are there any more pairs? Because you're primed to look for other sound locked pairs, fatal and furnaces, which simple alliteration, a kind of paronomasia, also you process them as a pair. And gap and grave also, and even tall and return is intended, I think, as a pair. And if you read the whole poem, I'm not going to read all the stanzas of it. If you read all the four stanzas, you see that the first three stanzas are completely isomorphic, right? Line 5 is, "Oh, do you imagine said fear to fairer? Or what was that bird said hard to hear?" So that super reinforces the paronomastic effect, which is why I picked this poem. It shows with complete clarity to me, maybe it's nobody else. It's a bit like Spinoza saying something is self-evident, and then you read what he thinks is self-evident, you're like, what? I'm hoping to be a little more self-evident. So it shows with total clarity how locking words together into paronomastic pairs deforms their semantics. Reader and writer put together into a pair, they mean more than the sum of the separate meanings of reader and together with the separate meanings of writer. The pairing is dialectical. It defines each paired item as an equivalent, a parallel, and an antithesis of the other paired item, as its synonym, as its antonym, right? This is called parallelism in the broad sense. And this is kind of an argument that I beat to death in The Pirate Who Doesn't Know the Value of Pi. If you've read this book, there's the pirate and the parrot, and they form just such a pair. But the presence of paronomastic pairs doesn't make Auden's poem translingual. It's not enough. The poem would have been translingual if it would have been a little more metalinguistic. If the paronomasia were not just a device for organizing words, but also a theme. If the poem foregrounded the very process of speaking a language, or speaking one language rather than another. But the very simplicity of the poem lets us easily perceive the paronomastic principle, which is that similarity of form suggests similarity of meaning. And a more radical formulation of the paronomastic principle is that form generates content. And I remember being, I don't know, in college, 20, I remember reading some manifesto, I think maybe by Khrushchev, something by Russian futurism. I just remember writing in pen, form generates content in the margins. And I've been carrying that since. So that paronomasia has semantic effects was argued by Roman Jakobson at the end of the 50s in studies of poetics and linguistics, which generalize many early formalist insights, and before that, Russian futurist slogans. Jakobson also recognized that the paronomastic principle does not limit itself to phonetic similarities, but extends to all levels of formal repetition, any kind of formal repetition. Meter, rhyme, stanzaic isomorphism, grammatical, morphological isomorphisms has the effect of locking together repeating terms. Such paronomastic entanglement bears semantic consequences. The words feel right. They feel as if they belong together. One word starts to suggest another. They become associated with one or another. They prime for one another, and this affects their semantics. To put it otherwise, semantic relations arise when we build parallelisms upon paronomastically connected elements, words, phrases, lines, stanzas, etc. It's paronomasia that for Jakobson makes poetry into a Worfian, untranslatable genre, the only exception to his argument against the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. In On Translation, he argues that everything is translatable, but when you get to poetry, paronomasia gets in the way because the meanings are too entangled with one another by formal repetition. I'm focusing on the paronomastic principle because it so closely resembles the language learner's pseudo-etymological strategy for deciphering unknown words. When Jakobson writes that the pun, or to use a more erudite and perhaps more precise term, paronomasia, reigns over poetic art, he's building on previous analogies between poetic creation and etymological activity. Comparing word formations with paleontological, geological, or archaeological processes, critics and poets since Romanticism have assigned to the poet the task of feeling back along ancient lines of semantic change. I'm quoting Fenellosa, but there's Emerson, Shklovsky's starts, I think Shklovsky's first essay starts with the same idea, and so on and so forth. Jakobson, it's the idea that Jakobson repeats in 1921 was he's talking about Chlebnikov, and it's finally generalized in 1959, 1960 in his work, that poetry is paronomasia. Nonetheless, and here's a big problem, Jakobson, as well as all the others who make analogies between poetry and punning, or poetry and etymology, who talk about the essence of poetry, who talk about the essence of poetry in this manner, was thinking of classical poetry rather than contemporary poetry. By classical poetry, I mean the poetry that gives to formal repetition the task of lineation, of dividing a text into line breaks, dividing the speech flow into lines. It's speech flow rather than text, actually, because of what's coming. Lineation superimposes kind of a second kind of division system onto syntactic organization, onto division by sentences. While the meaning of words in ordinary language is determined syntactically from sentence context, the paratactic structure of lineation produces its own semantic effects. And there's a great book by the Russian formalist Yuri Tinyanov on this called The Semantics of Verse Language, or the Semantics of Poetic Language. He sees the effects of what this kind of structure as the foregrounding of connotation at the expense of denotation, right? Breaking the text or the speech flow down into these additional units makes the words more polysemic. And in general, for all the Russian formalists, this is how poetic semantics estranges and defamiliarizes the semantics of ordinary language. By contrast, contemporary poetry demarcates its language as poetic by a much greater variety of methods, almost all of which rely on mechanical reproduction.
even the line breaks no longer come from formal repetition, since the printed page already tells us where one line ends and another begins, and ensures that different copies of the same printed poem will have lines break in the same places, right? If you're composing poetry in the 15th century, this is a problem. You need to have meter, right? Otherwise, nobody will know when the lines end. In the 20th century, people will know. Because formal repetition is no longer as crucial to contemporary poetry, the paronomastic principle might not lie at the heart of modern poetry at all, although it does maintain its centrality for translingualism. Or at least for my translingualism. I grew up between two poetic cultures in such a way that one of them, the Russian, was almost exclusively classical. And the other, that of American English, was almost exclusively contemporary. I mean, relatively speaking. And so I'm fated to keep colliding them in my poetry, whose language is obsessively paronomastic, but also non-classical in its lack of any kind of systematic formal patterning. Like my lines end arbitrarily. Because the attitude towards language in my poetry is metalinguistic, like I watch what I say, work becomes about their collisions, about the inability of the systems to agree or to join, and about their Worfian untranslatability with respect to one another. This is what makes my poetry translingual as far as I'm concerned. But other poets who come from very different mixed linguistic, cultural, and poetic backgrounds will explain and perform the irreconcilables in their background in ways other than mine. It may be that there's no single correct expression of translingualism. And in fact, that is the single correct expression of translingualism. Or I may be saying that simply because it makes for a nice ending. Thank you. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Eugene. That was great. I was thinking about James Joyce periodically during your talk, like especially Finnegan's Wake, and aware that he taught in Berlitz language schools. So he was constantly thinking about that, just in the Anglo-Irish.
I mean,
polyglot.
Right. But also, I mean, I was actually thinking about this when I was working on this, because if Joyce had stayed in Dublin, there would have been no Finnegan's Wake, right? I mean, Trieste is a key experience, right? I mean, he's placed into the most multilingual city of that part of Europe, and then he moves to Paris. I mean, there's also, yeah, so there's the English teaching also. And then there's just the stuff in the street.
Yeah. So we should open up for questions. Elliot, how do we do that?
So if people click reactions at the bottom and then raise their hand using the raise hand tool, you should be able to see who wants to chime in and just go from there.
Yeah, unmute yourself when you ask a question, and otherwise stay muted, please.
It's also possible to ask on chat.
Yeah.
You feel that.
I'm seeing bravo, beautiful. Wow. Thank you. Fantastic. No questions yet. There's a lot there to think about.
Okay, while you're thinking, I'm going to read one poem, which, if I may, is that okay?
Of course.
Which talks about translation, because I feel like I haven't really talked enough about translation here. If I can find it. Yeah, it's called 14 Ways of Looking at a Translator. And I wrote this in Shanghai. I started by standing outside the subway, and I think you can tell. If a poet stands outside the subway entrance long enough, a translator is bound to emerge. The poet was rising from the subway by escalator. Was there a translator behind the poet? The poet and the translator are one. The publisher omitted the source text. Stationary, the poet transferred from one train of thought to another. The translator ran for the shuttle, weaving among the people and also unweaving. The translator lies in a trance. Does the
We have a
poet possess?
question in the chat. That I'd
Okay.
be happy to read out so that everyone can hear it. The question is from Barrett Watton, and the question is as follows. So there are so many reasons to get Jakobson back into the conversation about poetics. Translingualism is the perfect vehicle for that. What else brings Jakobson into the present of poetics?
What else brings Jakobson into the present of poetics? I mean, there's just so much. I think in a way the basic issue with Jakobson, whose work is so rich and is so resonant, is that the question here is how to translate these insights so that they apply to the kind of poetry that Jakobson did not grow up with. Does that make sense? To contemporary poetry. And I think that's hard. I'm not 100% sure that could be done. But I think that's really the basic issue. I think Jakobson says a huge amount about classical poetry, but yeah.
First, can I say, I would love it if you would read your poem again. I don't think you got to the end of it. Isn't that right? So this is my two-part question. That's my first part, is to read the poem. But my question is, I guess, a simple one. Have you translated your own work into Russian or from Russian into English? But first read the poem and then do the second.
Okay. All right. I'm going to start from the top. It's a short poem. 14 ways of looking at a translator. If a poet stands outside the subway entrance long enough, a translator is bound to emerge. The poet was rising from the subway by escalator. Was there a translator behind the poet? The poet and the translator are one. The publisher omitted the source text. Stationary, the poet transferred from one train of thought to another. The translator ran for the shuttle, weaving among the people and also unweaving. The translator lies in a trance. Does the poet possess the translator? Does the translator possess the poet? The apparition of these men and women in the subway, is there no publisher among them? The poet took the ABC at West 4th. The translator took the 123 at Borough Hall. One searched for a subway station called Ithaca and found 3 subways in Ithaca, while the other proceeded to Utica Avenue in search of integrity. The poet and the translator were riding the escalator, which was scaly like Garion's back. They weighed each other with scales. The poet found the translator wanting. The translator found the poet wanting. To be more specific, the poet found the translator wanting the publisher, while the translator found the poet wanting the publisher. If a poet stands outside the subway entrance long enough, a translator is bound to emerge from another entrance or exit. The poet was rising to the surface and already saw natural light at the entrance, which is also the exit. The translator stood one step below on the escalator, holding the publisher's hand. The poet turned around on the escalator. The translator said, "I'm going home. There's no correspondence between the words of our languages."
Okay.
Do I translate myself? I have worked I've helped a friend translate one of my earlier books into Russian. um, in a way, especially the kind of stuff I do, I've participated in like translations of me. I'm a little afraid to do it solo, not so much because I'm afraid, but because it requires, especially now, a total remake of the poem. So it just has to be, to be translated has to say something else. So yeah, I mean, it's something that I still need to develop how to do. I would like to. But yeah, Marjorie, hi.
Hi, and I started this on the chat. You didn't say anything about pound, but I recently was assigned to do something on the wasteland for the centennial, and I realized that whereas pound is the great person of first person, I mean the cantos are nothing but foreign tags. And the funny thing is that Elliot sort of does that in the wasteland, but he mostly translates them. And I want to ask you about that issue. In other words, Pound will say, Siena mi fe, difecemi marema. That becomes the title of a whole section, although it's not about La Pia at all. It's about Mr. Verog, and it's funny, and the pre-Raphaelites. But then when Eliot takes that, it becomes something made me, Marema, whatever bad place, maybe Richmond and Q undid me, and he changes it. Or let's say, I started asking myself, when does Eliot translate Dante? I had not thought death had undone so many. And on the other hand, he'll leave it in Italian when it's Arno Daniel, poi s'ascosa nel fuoco che li affina. So why sometimes is it translated into English, and why do you leave it in the original language? And I have that question about a lot of poets, where some people will take the illusion and translate them automatically and feel better about translating them. Eliot himself will leave it in German when it's bin gar keine Russin, echt Deutsch. I love that line. And that has to be in German, I think. Bin gar keine Russin, bin Litauen, echt Deutsch. You couldn't really do it in English, but others are translated. And you do that, I think, sometimes too. So what is the relation of the translated passages to one's left? What is the theoretical, I guess, thing behind that? To one's left in the original. Pound, of course, has it all, the Chinese, then of course he often translates it. But I notice when he gives readings, he often just leaves those out, the ideograms. So it becomes very complicated.
Look, there's something parodic about translation, right? Translation in some ways is a form of parody. It's especially a form of parody when it's, in the wasteland, but it's also like, when Siena mi fe, and then, and then you go, I don't know, you go to like a less poetic, less conventionally poetic place than Siena, right? Or Maremma, whatever. Does that make sense? But very often, like, especially, I've tried translating Mandelstam, right? And when you try to translate, especially a text like Mandelstam or Dante, you're constantly fighting, like, is this a parody or is this a translation? But very often I translate parodically on purpose because there's things you could do with that. And I think, talking off the top of my head, I think that's what the wasteland does, right? It does things with translating parodically, right? There's ways of translating when you translate also into, modern prosaic circumstances.
Yeah.
Right. But then there's also, when you put in the original language, there's also, and I think this is sometimes in Pound, there's also like a fetishism of the original language, and rather than a conversation with it. Does that make sense?
Yes.
But it's there, and you're like, wow, this can't be put into any other way.
But what I learned about the wasteland is that And there's what? Latin, Greek, Italian, French, German, and the Sanskrit. The Sanskrit is a little pretentious. If you really look at it, it rhetorically works. I mean, Ganga was sunken sounds more interesting than the Ganges was sunken, perhaps, but it's a little pretentious. But what about Hebrew? And that is the fascinating thing. You can see the anti-Semitism right there. Namely, the prophets who play a big role, both Ezekiel and Ecclesiastes, is that whole passage that comes from the prophets, but of course it comes from the King James Bible. And I once asked somebody at Oxford, I said, why doesn't it come from Hebrew? I mean, if you have Sanskrit, you could have the Hebrew, the actual Hebrew. And this professor said to me, oh, but I mean, it's the King James Bible. Obviously, in other words, it's equated with English. And that is true of the poem. When you deal with Isaiah and Ezekiel and Ecclesiastic, they're sort of made English, and this fits with a lot of things you said. They're turned into English writers, and people just take for granted that, of course, comes from the King James Bible. But of course, Robert Alter has pointed out right, how beautiful and how complicated the puns are with the Hebrew. But of course, there's no Hebrew.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, this is kind of the more political aspect of translingualism, when you are aware not only of what the language says, but what the history of that language saying it and what the history of the translation.
Yes. Yeah.
There's a question. Oh yeah, Barrett Watson is asking about linguistic rhythm. I don't know if I can answer that. That's I can't answer that off the top of my head.
Eugene, there's some hand signals
Oh,
up on
okay,
the
sorry.
participant. Then the top one is from Harsha Ram.
Yeah.
Thank you for a fascinating talk, Eugene. My question refers to the distinction that you made between multilingualism and translingualism, but also between the written and the spoken. So if I understood correctly, multilingualism would involve something like code switching between two or more languages that remain distinct, and which are adapted or invoked as a kind of conscious literary strategy that would require glossing and that assumes a certain kind of cultural as well as linguistic hierarchy of languages of the kind that, say, Marjorie Perloff just cited with respect to, say, Pound or Elliot. And by contrast, translingualism would be a kind of hybridization of utterance in which neither language needs to be perfectly mastered, but where most or both languages are actually understood and known by the interlocutors who are participating in a given conversation. So, for example, in the example that you gave of Petya speaking to his grandmother, "My idiom na lake, babushka," that was an utterance that was understood by all those who were present and participating in the conversation. So I find it particularly interesting that when this is manifested in speech, it's a kind of demotic utterance, right, that is not intended to be defamiliarizing, right? And in fact, it's something that you could verify in any New York subway, in the streets of Queens or East Harlem or Oakland, California. And I'm interested in them as these kind of, primarily as kind of demotic manifestations of a kind of densely packed multicultural or multi-ethnic space. What you're talking about with translingualism is a kind of meta discourse in which that kind of demotic condition becomes elevated and objectified into a kind of conscious poetic strategy. And I'm wondering, in that process of translation from a demotic utterance to a literary strategy, what exactly happens? Does it lose its democratic flavor of being a kind of quotidian democratic utterance, demotic utterance, or does it remain in some ways linked to the social milieu from which it comes, which is that of partial linguistic mastery and coexistence between multiple languages, which is the condition of so many immigrants, and not only in the United States. And so in that sense, does it become already a kind of meta-language a la, say, a kind of utopian linguistic world in the manner of, say, of the Russian avant-garde?
or does it retain some kind of organic connection to the social humus from which it actually arises? So that would be my question.
Okay, that's a really complicated question. Okay, so I'm going to try to answer as much of it as I can. So first, so the multilingualism versus translingualism distinction is not quite mine. It's actually not mine. It comes, the terms are a little different, but it ultimately comes from Yasemin Yildiz, and also Sarah Dowling does the same thing. They talk about the use of foreign language in advertising in the States, where it's foreign, but you know what it says, right? Like, I forget which one of them talk. Oh yeah, I think Sarah Dowling talks about a Coca-Cola ad, which is sung in different languages, but you know what it says because you know the song. So this is what they call multilingualism, and this is what they don't like. Is this the best term? I don't know, but you know, I think my job was to report. For at this point of the paper of the talk, the job was to report on the usage of this term. Whereas translingualism, for them, violates the linguistic norms that multilingualism presupposes. Okay. Now, as far as the second part of your question, it's a great question. And unfortunately, the answer is it depends. So you can take code switching in the subway and you can encounter this in a book, and you can read this as an elitist move. You can also encounter it in a book, and you can read it as not an elitist move. I don't know which is the right reading, and I don't know if there is a right reading. I think a really fundamental issue now with quotation, with translingualism in poetry, is that all of us read close to our electronic devices. And if you want to find something out, it's actually very easy to do so. And in the book in which I'm working on now, I even like some really obscure, like some Russian stuff, I put footnotes in the back in small print. I don't know if the publisher is going to accept that. But like things that are hard to look up, I'll happily note, just not under the poem, but like somewhere. For me personally, as a poet, I try to write in my own language, right? In the language that I feel. And because of the kind of disorganized way in which I live, it's a lot of different languages, and so in a way, for me, language mixing is very personal. Like when I moved to Germany, like, you know, in fact, I started playing with German before, but then I really started playing with German when I moved to Germany. German is great for English because it just has so many false friends. But then there's also the public issue in that it's much harder to put Russian in than I don't know, in the Indo-European language that's done in the Roman alphabet, in the Latin alphabet, is fairly easy to look up. Russian is not easy to look up for people who don't know any Russian, right? And this is why I thought I would put footnotes at the end of the book. So, if that makes sense. Yeah, Persian, Arabic, yeah, Chinese, there's, yeah.
We have another, I don't mean to interrupt you.
No, that's it.
All right. The next question is from Ivan Sokolov.
Hello, everyone. Hello, Eugene. Thanks for the talk. It was quite nice to hear you talk about your own practice. And I think those parts of the talk were particularly lively and stimulating. The question I have, though, kind of asks that you go back slightly to the sources and the premises. And I would like to invite you to reflect on, or I suppose maybe even interrogate, the concept of monolingualism from which you proceed. I think at the beginning of your talk, you were trying to make a case for translingual or translingualist poetry by saying that it's important to trace and maybe even occasion those collisions between languages that either are experienced as, I don't know, mobile elite, or vice versa, as deprived classes and parts of world nations is subject to, or maybe this is instead something that we need to effect to achieve in the world regardless. So there's an importance of this violent contact or conflict between languages that you advocate for. But then what exactly is this other thing that you're trying to go away from? What exactly is the monolingual situation? And because it's either taken for granted or remains a kind of a blind spot, something that you don't speak much about in your talk, it begins to appear a sort of a construct or even a reflex of something like, you know, a nationalist utopian monolingualism, of the kind of monolingualism that, say, those that are in power in my own country, in the Russian Federation, would like to propose. The monolingualism of, let's say, let's never use any loan words. Is that really the case that you're fighting? Well, how successful is your fight? And then is that really the case for poetry? Maybe not, but then what exactly would that monolingualism be? Because I think as you rightly share in your lecture, and all of us are witnesses to it on an everyday basis, any sentence from something like my friends and I are going to the lake to my amigos and I are going to a lago, or I don't know, let's use, well, you could all provide, I think, correspondent examples in your own languages, but that is also an everyday situation. Not necessarily only people who are of a given class, but, you know, being plugged in international communication means, is that a monolingualism that you would also try to distance from? What is this initial position from which you're trying to evaporate, or maybe you just have to because that's your own situation? And those were, I think, the parts of the talk that were the most successful in terms of demonstrating the situation.
So the initial position, again, this is, so the stuff about monolingualism, monolingual paradigm, it's also from the part of my talk where I'm trying to explain other people's terminology. But I can see where the terminology is coming from. Now, you can easily extend, I mean, even the requirement that there be more than one language present in a poem, you could easily extend it to a situation that is in one language, but two dialects, right? The basic issue is that what you want is you need collision, right? There can't be one way, the way of saying something can't be one way.
I suppose, to put my questions in easier terms, is what do you think, maybe not monolingualism is, but what are the limits of a language for you?
Well, I think, so of that kind of language, I think, so you talk about, if we talk about Russian linguistic nationalism, Russia is a very good case. Not in the sense that we can't have any loan words. I mean, I think that's something that one is not likely to hear that often. I mean, we shouldn't have any loan words, you know, new loan words from American English. You could hear that, although pretty rarely. But what you hear very often in Russian is, we don't speak Russian this way. To which I answer, we speak Russian this way, right? You always hear this. There's like super, Russian is constructed you know, the linguistic, in terms of linguistic ideology, it's a super colonial language, in the sense in which, you know, if you make mistakes, if you deviate, right, it shows that you're not a suitable partner in the conversation. You see this all the time, right? When people are arguing, for example, on the internet, and I don't know, somebody misspells a word, right? And the other person says, you don't even speak Russian, right? Like this, I find really objectionable, right? And on the level of poetry, I'm not sure that this is quite the meaning of the slogan of to purify the language of the tribe. I think it's a very broad slogan, the kind of the Mallarmé slogan that Elliot takes up. But instinctually, there's like there's this song by the Ramones which goes, I'm against it. Like I feel like I'm against it. Does that make sense? But primarily what we're talking about, the Russian style standards of linguistic correctness, where linguistic correctness is basically, you know, social belonging to the group of people that are entitled to make opinions and judgments. And as soon as you deviate from it, you're just judged.
So you still want to have that initial position from which you deviate, the position of the norm, that is.
Well, I think it's, look, I mean, okay, so for me, I didn't talk about this in the paper, but for me, you know, when I read Kanagaraja or when I read translanguaging style, right, which is a parallel concept, you know, sometimes you read it and you're a little like, well, but there is such a thing as grammar, you know? So they are much more extreme than I am. But also sometimes you read Kanagaraja and it's all about these different ways of speaking English. And ultimately, you know, I don't think that you can have linguistic diversity in one language, if that makes sense, right? Even if it's global English. I think one always has to let in other languages. So, okay, good, thanks. Just more questions?
I think we have time for 2 more questions, which is a good thing because there are 2 questions that have been waiting for a long time. The next is Jen Scapatone.
Hi, Eugene. That was wonderful. I hope we can talk about this at greater in under calmer, non-pixelated circumstances. But I have a simple question, and I'm aware that the answer will not be simple, but I'm translating this horrible futurist book right now. And I kind of envy your access to the less nefarious futurism. So I think that's where this question emerges from. I'm curious about your initial move to say, I'm not interested in avant-garde utopianism. That's not what I'm doing, especially because you then speak of collisions and are referring back to Eisenstein, and so much of this work seems predicated on that precedent. But I'm basically wondering, what is the aspect of the utopianism? I mean, certainly the utopianism has been proven not to produce a utopia, like that much we all get. But what is it about that makes you want to pivot away from it? And how would you characterize the political environment under which translingual work is being produced now? And how would you distinguish it from that earlier moment? this is kind of selfish because I'm trying to do this from a different set of touchstones, and I'm really curious to hear your answer.
Well, okay, to start with futurism, there's a story, and I don't know if this is true. It might be that nobody knows whether this is true, but there's a story that in 1925, when Mayakovsky is visiting Paris, he secretly had a dinner with Marinetti. And that Marinetti was telling him that, we really both futurisms did the same things. We went with the fascists, you went with the communists. And nobody knows what his reaction was or whether this actually happened. I think I read this somewhere, a biography of Mayakovsky. Now, their utopianism is actually, if you look at the 20s, it's communist left-wing utopianism. If you look in the period before World War I, it's much more complicated. Because some of it is nationalist in a way that rhymes with the Italians, even though it's actually about being Asian rather than European. There's this whole slogan that Russians are Asians, which is a futurist slogan in 1913. But then some of it is just, it's really about shopping. It's about commercialism. It's about, and this is, like, I didn't realize this until I really got into the research and started reading entertainment magazines from 1913, which really puts things in perspective. And it's, for the guy that I'm working on most, for Kaminsky, futurism is just, it's about all the things that modern life brings: airplanes, elevators. It's very material, right? And this is a guy that participated in the 1905 revolution, who was imprisoned, but it's still, it's really about consumer products. It's about, look at me, I write about cars. But the utopianism later, after 1917, becomes very different. It becomes what we think of as avant-garde utopianism. For me personally, I want this kind of stuff as analytical tools that help my own, if you want, linguistic skepticism. For other poets, there are many other ways of doing translingual poetry which are very different from mine, and that have very different political ramifications. And if you look at Sarah Dowling's books, that's what she talks about. Her book, Translingual Poetics. A lot of it is about the politics of the translingual gestures, but the politics depends on which languages you work with and in which contexts, right? So, for me, if I'm sitting in Germany and if I'm using German, that's going to have a very different meaning. I try to write a series of pieces. So I've always been not able to really write about something that I think of as my history in English, because it feels weird in English. It doesn't feel right. So I tried to write, I wound up writing something about it, about the blockade of Leningrad in 1941, which is my history only in not very mediated ways, but it's something that, like, when I was growing up, this is what I kept hearing about from my grandparents all the time. And there, the languages serve fairly clear functions, because there, when German appears, it's not just German, right? I mean, it's historically justified. So where you are, who you are, what you're talking about, who is reading you, all of that shifts all the time, but it's that determines the politics.
So would you want to draw like a contour around the kind of work to which everything you've just said applies? I'm kind of curious about that.
What do you mean?
Because you were sort of talking about the workings of translingualism at large. Is it like the poetics that depends on the languages, or just the politics?
I
think you're talking about the latter only.
Yeah, I think the poetics also depends on the languages. I think when I try to think about it, me with my background in Russian formalism, I'm not gonna get the same results as somebody that has a different background. So the background is involved also. I mean, in a way that there's no escaping context.
All right, time for one last question. Daniel, Tiffany. And thanks for being patient.
Hi, Eugene.
Hey, Daniel.
Nice. You know, it was so nice to hear everything laid out in kind of full dress and hear you talk about the terms carefully.
Yeah.
I'm sure, like a lot of people, even though knowing you and Ulian and having talked to you in bits and pieces, I wonder what translingualism is. So it was really helpful. It seems important to be able to think, for me to be able to just think a little bit about it. So it was really helpful to hear it all laid out and for you to have the chance, which is, one of the wonderful things about a lecture like this is to invite someone that, and just give you the chance to really lay it out and as you say, write it over 5 times and give us this version. But so I just a really quick question, which is a follow-up to Harsha's question, which was its distinction between the pragmatic demotic version of translingualism and then the poetic, sort of version of it that you articulated. You seemed, when you talked about the model that of translingualism and the paronomasic principle, identify that with something like second, and the idea that we learn through form and that form produces contact, that was not the model of the native speaker. That was the model of someone that had learned a language later in life. Is that right?
Okay.
In other words, I was wondering whether Harsha's distinction, or the 2 versions, was something like the difference between the way that one learns a language and the way that one experiences a language as your native language, and the way that one experiences a language as a second language learner. Whether those 2 differences map onto each other.
Yeah, I mean, I think, okay, so one is that I don't think there's a clear-cut border here, right?
Yeah.
But I think very often, at least in my experience, the estrangement that you get when you're learning something, like at one point, you'll realize that these 2 words are connected.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And you can also realize this as a native speaker. It's not that you can't.
Mm-hmm.
It's that there's something about language learning which is all about this process.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas speaking a language that you're completely fluent in, you just don't speak about the language so much. I mean, you don't think about the languages you speak. You
Yep.
think about what you want to say,
Mhm. Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
And so it's a bit, I guess it's a bit like, I mean, it's okay. So like when you surf, right? Like if you start thinking about surfing, like I'm standing wrong, right? You're standing on the wave. You're like, wait, I'm standing wrong. You know, what happens is you fall off the board.
Mhm. Mhm.
Or I mean,
And that falling
so-
off the board is crucial to your understanding of translingualism. Of falling off because you think too much about it, or you think about it so you fall off.
yeah,
That's
yeah.
the model of translingualism.
But it's also like when you're a really good surfer, you don't really think about that.
Yeah.
You
So
know?
my last question is it's a follow-up in a way to Yvonne's question, although I want to think of monolingualism not as a paradigm that you had to define, but simply the question of using just one language. So what I ended up being confused with about the talk was whether your sense of translingualism actually requires two languages, like code switching, or whether translingualism is entirely possible within a single language. As you said, there was this one paradigm of code switching. There has to be two languages. The second one, which is that your understanding of translingualism can occur within a poem that's written in a single language. So
there were two different paradigms.
Yeah.
And I think there's basically a fine gradation.
Mhm.
I mean, it's not like this poem is translingual, this poem is not. The poem that I read, The 14 Ways of Looking at the Translator, is all in English.
Right.
There are lots and lots of puns in it.
Mhm.
But off the top of my head, I can't think whether it has Russian puns or something. But in the context of the rest of my work, and in the context of the fact that it's talking about translation, and it's actually a piece in a cycle of poems about translation and Orpheanism. In that context makes it seem like more like a translingual poem. If you completely isolate it, there's nothing about it that says it's translingual in the same way as if, boom, I put like a Chinese character in the middle of it and then had the poem explaining the Chinese character. Like that would be a no-brainer. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, Eugene. Thank you all for coming out or staying in, I guess is what we've all done here on a Sunday day or night. Thanks to those of you who are in the East Coast of the US or in Europe, Russia, elsewhere, for staying up so late. And the rest of us will go back to Sunday. Eugene, I'll be in touch on email. I have lots of questions to ask, much to say. And yeah, thank you all. Thanks, Elliot, again. Yeah, bye.
Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.